Mondays with Mike. Harvard. According to the Trump administration, Harvard may no longer enroll international students, and even the existing ones evidently must transfer. Seems like it might be a move by the Trump administration of get in line or we'll make an example of you. There's also the question, which I didn't write about here, but of whether it's legal and whether it will stick. And that'll be a confounding factor if an international student does want to transfer, how long that will take to resolve. But you previously spoke, Mike, about international students being a huge source of income for universities. However, of course, Harvard would have a large endowment. So are they immune from the effects? Can they weather this storm? How much of a storm is it anyway?
It's a big deal. A quarter of their student body is international students. I think it's 27%. And the deal with international students is they usually pay significantly more, and they're generally not eligible for certain kinds of financial aid from the government. What that means is that they're paying full freight, and they usually pay a lot more money for housing, board, because the cohort of students that are international students, they're already part of the global top whatever percent of people. Because if you can afford to pay full tuition for a place like Harvard, you're generally from, not always, right? Sometimes there's students who are here on scholarships or a variety of other things, but the general understanding is that a lot of these students are wealthy enough because they have to prove that they can actually pay to attend, that they're wealthy enough. They generally have to prove that they can attend the school, and then they can attend the school. But in terms of weathering the storm, I think there's an issue here that isn't really being talked about. And usually the endowment's money is tied to the investments that they're doing, and it costs a lot of money to take money out of the endowment. The whole point of an endowment is you put the money in and then you get a return from that money. If the college has to keep dipping into its endowment, it costs a lot of money. But the other issue has to do with income, that these students provide a stable, reliable source of income that they know is coming in year after year that helps to fund all the other stuff that the university can do. And no, at the end of the day, they're not immune. Harvard's a business. They have income from a variety of things. One of those things is the endowment, but the other area is the grants, loans, student tuition. It's a huge hit, right? If they lose that much money, it sends a really terrible message to all the universities that have international students that if you don't comply to the letter of whatever the Trump administration's whims are, you're going to lose a huge amount of your money. About the question of whether it's legal, I'm not so sure because they're a private business and the Trump administration is trying to do something that seems, I don't know that I call it fishy, but it seems to violate, as far as I can tell, the warrantless search and seizure, that they're trying to get a list of all the names of all the students, and they want video footage of anyone who participated in what there's some ambiguity as to whether all the speech is protected or not, but it looks like a fishing expedition, like a dragnet. And the whole deal there is usually you need a warrant, right, to search any video, any evidence of any crime. There's a serious question here, and I'm sure Harvard will litigate this out in court, but all of these students ostensibly should have the same rights as anybody else for protections from search and seizure of their property. They've got all sorts of rights to like a fair trial, to not be, we're talking Fifth Amendment stuff, no self-incrimination. There's a whole list of things going on here that I'm just skeptical that it is legal for the Trump administration to do, which is why I think there was that temporary hold from the judge of this actually going forward, of stopping the international students from being able to attend Harvard. Talking about it setting a chilling effect, right? It's terrible for brand America from the outset because it makes the country seem very unwelcome. Think of the message it sends that the government says, oh, you cannot attend this very prestigious, world renowned university any longer. And the only way you can stay in the country is if you switch to a different school. Okay, that's how you get a brain drain. That's how you get China giving unconditional offers to all the Harvard students. Come to our schools, right? We won't kick you out. We want you. And all the other European universities, like I'm sure, are all chomping at the bit because they all compete for the same pool of students, right? Because the students, one, they contribute to the culture of the university, but also, again, they're part of the group of people who are willing to pay full freight to travel across the world and live in a foreign country to pursue their education. That's the kind of student universities want because it means that they don't have to worry about not receiving tuition or having to do debt collection and all that stuff. But it's also the prestige of the university, right? Harvard can say that they have students and alumni who are from royal families, from very famous celebrities. The list goes on of that whole level of prestige that elevates the value of going to Harvard in particular for networking. And if you remove that, it removes the value overall for all students attending Harvard. That
Mm-hmm.
you're no longer sharing dormitories and sharing meals and classes with the rich and the well connected. It looks terrible, right? The whole scenario right now, it looks cruel, it looks awful, and it just my heart goes out in particular for students they've shelled out tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to pursue their educations for a bachelor's. And a lot of students are actually graduate students, right? Masters or PhDs at these universities where they've spent 5 years, sometimes 10 years, depending on whatever you're studying, especially for medical students or anyone that's like in really specialized areas of study, a really long time. And it's not so clear that what they're studying at Harvard or the credits they get will always transfer in full to any of these other universities. It's just unimaginably cruel. I think they can do it, right? That they can, because it is a privilege, right? That in terms of the visas, since the government ultimately decides who gets a visa and it's at their discretion. We learned that with Marco Rubio. He can just deny someone's visa for whatever reason they can come up with. It's within his power, but it sends an awful message in terms of diplomacy, in terms of culture, and in terms of capitalism, right? Since when has the government been able to swoop in and tell a business, we're going to cut off all of your money? We're going to cut off all the payments that you're receiving. It'd be like if the government told Microsoft they can't sell their computers to like schools or something. It's a whole thing. It's the government effectively picking winners and losers in what's supposed to be a free market economy. It doesn't seem free if they're punishing to such a degree.
Yeah. If it speaks again to that theme of a lack of a clear condition in which to do business. But how about this? If you were a student, an international student, going to Harvard, would you transfer if you could, or would you risk it? Would you hold out and hope that a solution was found? But even if it wasn't, you'd still have the story to tell.
Oh, I'd risk it. You go to Harvard because you want the Harvard degree. You want the ultimately you want the little stamp of success like on your resume and in your networking and all your opportunities to say, look, I went to the most prestigious university arguably in the world, and graduated from it. That's the whole reason that it has such broad appeal compared to some. That's in part why they're being targeted, is because they have the money to sit there and fight back and say no, that some of these smaller universities might not be able to. It sets the stage for this sort of titanic battle, right? Because if Trump can win here against Harvard, then everybody else falls in line. If the number one university with the most money can be cowed into submission, then all the other universities have to make a very serious choice: comply in advance or lose all their money. A lot of these universities actually rely on these international students to make their money to operate. It's just the way it is because the students pay much more, and there are market conditions that make it that universities have to have a certain number of international students or a certain number of students from out of state that pay much greater money so that they can pay all their professors and the staff and the overhead costs, right, of having a physical campus, of maintaining all the buildings and the dorms, blah blah blah. All that costs money, and the prices are only increasing. In some respects, what's worse for Harvard is Trump going after the tax exempt status of some elements of how Harvard has makes money. That's a bigger deal, right? Because that affects a lot more money than what we're talking about, even with the international students. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's a whole thing. This goes back to that brand America thing too, though, that it creates a chilling effect, right? That creates an opening for these universities in other countries to reach out an olive branch to these students and say, look, we'll give you a scholarship, we'll give you some benefit. We'll give you research funding. We'll give you a lab. We'll give you, housing. Go to our university and we promise we're not going to do these shenanigans. Our government wants you. And that's the message I think that's being sent to future students. It's not clear that the government wants them to attend universities in the United States. That's the message being heard loud and clear. But no, to your question, if I was there and I was a student, I would stay right until I get kicked out. I want that degree because it's a very competitive school to apply to. If you look at the numbers for admissions, most people who apply do not get in for all of the Ivy League schools, but Harvard in particular, really small percentages of people actually get into the college. Yeah, if you get into that, it's a step up the ladder of life's success to actually graduate from Harvard. It's not attending, it's actually graduating. That's the pedigree. That's the thing that opens doors because businesses want to say they hire Harvard graduates. They want to do that promotion, especially things like law schools, and they want to do in their marketing material. We have Harvard graduates, or we have Yale graduates, or we have Princeton graduates. There's a certain level of prestige that's attached to the name that other schools don't have as much. It's the way the world works.
Yeah. Developing issue, the battle lines are drawn, and we will keep an eye on it because a ruling of one kind or another would make sense. RFK's report, Robert Kennedy, Health and Human Services Secretary, says that this generation of American children is the sickest in the history of the country. The report said that it was because of 1. Ultra-processed food, 2. Environmental toxins, 3. Lack of exercise and high stress, and 4. The overprescribing of medicines. Now, my take on this is the prescription of medicines, the parent kind of influences that, but generally I think doctors know what they're doing. I'm sure there are exceptions, but generally when the public are like, oh, doctors are doing this too much, yeah, I trust the doctors. The ultra-processed food and the environmental toxins, I believe that. Those just sound, okay, those are things you need government regulation for. And then the third one, high stress and lack of exercise, would both seem to me to be due to the phone. Now that's just me, but it would seem like the phone is making the kids stressed. That's just my idea. But I don't even know if any of this is true. I don't even know if the report is true. And why doesn't the report contain solutions? What do you think?
I think one issue that immediately was thinking about this is that it's not necessarily that we're the sickest ever, but that the ability to detect illness and sickness and the data collecting methods have significantly improved.
Much like with autism.
Sure, that we have a much better ability right now to figure out what's wrong and what's going on. And so there's an argument to be made that there was an underprescription of medicines in past generations because they didn't know. Like for a long time, if you think about germ theory, doctors didn't wash their hands as much as they could have. Okay. Think about all the pandemics, all the diseases, all the random stuff that happened to people over the years. There were very serious limits in terms of access to medical care, but also in terms of understanding what was a medical issue or condition, right? That something that may have been relegated in the past to they're crazy, now we know might not be crazy, but it could be like a chemical imbalance in someone's brain, or it could be something that was discovered more recently and that there's now a better answer to. There's a bunch of assumptions built into the report and the arguments that are presented that are flawed from the outset, that effectively they're arriving at a conclusion without enough data to substantiate the arguments that are being presented. That's, I think, an issue I have with the way RFK Jr. has presented some of these things throughout his tenure as a cabinet secretary, is that they arrive in some cases at a conclusion without necessarily the data always to back it up. And that's a problem. But no, I agree in terms of the ultra processed foods and the environmental toxins. For toxins in particular, it's because of the fact that the US isn't as much of a walking culture as it could be compared to other countries. So if you look at other countries that have lower rates of, in particular, obesity, I'm thinking Japan, the amount that the average Japanese person walks, it's like way higher than Americans walk. The US is a very sedentary society. We rely on cars a lot to get around because there's not enough sidewalks, there's not enough public transportation that's affordable. The infrastructure isn't built for people to walk. Where I noticed this in particular when I went to Alabama is that the difference between Seattle and Birmingham was that in Seattle there's a sidewalk on like every corner. You can walk almost everywhere. Birmingham, no way. I tried to walk from where I was staying to just get to a McDonald's. There were no crosswalks. There were no sidewalks. And it was like, what am I going to do? I don't have a
Yeah.
car. I'm not renting
I
a
went
car.
I went to Europe and I walked everywhere 2 hours a day or more, and it was awesome. It wasn't raining. I like walking here, but living in the suburbs, yeah, I use a car a lot. And biking could be good too. So we don't have a walking culture or a biking culture, not predominantly.
Yeah, I lived in Europe for a time, for 3 or 4 years, and I've been to Italy in particular many times. And there's a, it's not just an emphasis on walking though. It's also, if we're talking about stress, it's an emphasis on taking leisure time, like taking naps, making sure you set aside time deliberately to just not, work or not be so focused all the time on these high stress activities. But talking about the solutions, the biggest problem is that our medical care system is so haphazard, right? That it's siloed off between like people who have access to it and people who definitely don't. And it's very expensive to get access in some cases to medical care and treatment unless you can afford it for those people who are stuck in between the two extremes. So Medicaid provides medical access and care to the very poor, and then Medicare for those who are older, right? But everybody's squeezed in between the very poor, and those are chips also for children provide some access to healthcare. But for everybody else, you're stuck in like a private marketplace subject to market conditions that are way higher for cost than almost everywhere else in the world for prescription drugs, just access to regular treatment and care. And that I think definitely contributes more than these other things that they're talking about, like the ultra processed foods or the toxins, is that okay, say those are a factor. The issue is that people who could get help aren't always getting the help they need. So think about lead poisoning and lead in the water. There's a real issue, and we saw this during the first campaign with Hillary. Remember Flint, Michigan, where they weren't getting access to a safe living environment, and the problem was about money. They didn't want to do the fix. That was a Republican administration where he appointed like a special person that had authority over all the local authorities to do the thing. It's similar to what we're seeing with Doge, where Doge goes in and they say, oh, we have the authority to just fire half your people, right? Or to stop all these grants and loans. In most cases, when somebody is addressing a problem and they're hired to address it, there's external forces and pressures in America in particular that stop those problems from being addressed fully. So I'm thinking right now about the workers who were fired at like the nuclear waste facilities and the toxic treatments and people working like in there's a word for them, the super sites or whatever, the sites where there's a serious need for environmental cleanup if there was like a spill or there was some kind of effect that it affected the water or the air of an area
some
where
kind of environmental hazard site.
yeah, when you're talking about environmental toxins, if you're saying there's a problem but then you're firing the solution to that problem, you're just making the problem worse. HHS is a great example. They fired thousands of people. And Kennedy's been asked multiple times by journalists, you say you want to address lead. Why did you fire the lead people? You say you want to address food issues. Why are you firing the nutrition? Why removing one of the elements that could help to solve the problem? Remember, in some of these cases, especially for orphan diseases, which do you know what an orphan disease is? It's a very rare disease that affects a small number of people.
I didn't know the word, but yeah, I know the concept. Yeah.
The notion is that the private market isn't going to invest money in R&D if they don't
Okay.
see a return. And so that's where you get the government to step in and study these diseases and study these issues because they don't have to make money from that research. They can just figure out a cure and then provide it to the people who need it or to the medical community at large who then can figure out a way to make money. But the initial start for studying a lot of these diseases is people who are doing research, right? People who are pursuing their PhDs, their medical degrees, their medical research. And the way to fund biomedical research, usually the way it was working, was through the NIH and the NSF and all these different major groups that would do that grant program. And then they'd have the competitive grants. And then you come up with a solution to some of these problems. If those people aren't getting the research money that they need from the government, it's not so clear that there's a private philanthropic replacement when we're talking about all these diseases, environmental toxins, ultra processed food. Who do you think studying that stuff? The FDA, right? The EPA, the scientists. You fire all the scientists. Who's going to study? The universities? the universities were getting their grants through the government, right? It's all interconnected, and it's infuriating that they put out this report without acknowledging that they are part of the issue that's making these issues worse, right? It's one thing to say, oh, there's a problem. It's another to say that we have the fix, right? We are the people that are actually working actively to make it better rather than worse. And that's my issue with the way that the report's presented and talked about and argued, is that
Yeah.
there's just this complete disconnect. And it's bizarre.
Yeah, it sounds like the altered processed food and the environmental toxins are things requiring regulation that we don't necessarily concur with a report on a prescription of medicines. And you've pointed out that activity is a lot of what can remedy it, and that makes sense to me. That would address both lack of exercise.
Oh, I was going to say for the lack of exercise as well. Yes, you're right. It's the phones. It's also computers that we've integrated computers and phones so much in our lives from such a young age that in
Yeah.
many cases it becomes very difficult to extricate young people
Exactly.
from always looking at their phone because it's just sort of part of
Yeah.
their daily day. It's part of their.
And there's a trend in education and in child rearing as well away from that, and whereas everybody was subject to it for the past 15, 20 years, now we will have data in some time, and there'll be a divergence, and then we'll be able to say better.
It's a dilemma, right? Because the
Yeah.
future is being connected to the computers and phones and being able to navigate the world with those things. If you prevent young people, students from learning how to navigate with those technologies, that actually sets them back compared to other parts of the world that don't. So it really is a dilemma, right? Because the trade off is a better short term outcome for
Yeah.
stress and physical health in terms of walking more and exercising and that stuff versus being technologically illiterate. There's a whole trade off there. It's tricky, right? Because the future is not going back to like manual labor and manufacturing. The future is figuring out a way to work with computers, to work with AI, and find a place for human labor at all. There's a real effort to replace human labor entirely. All labor, thought labor, manual labor, you name it. So the only ones who are
Mhm.
going to succeed in that world are people who both understand the technology, but also understand how to do value add, right? That's the trade off of any industrial revolution, any transition of technology. We're going to
Mhm.
see.
We are, and although I definitely agree with you in terms of that the future will have technology and that people will need to be able to use the technology, I would have more to say at a different time, and I don't necessarily think that the future of education will be so permeated with a Chromebook in every student's hand at all times. I think it would be better if it was more intentional, but I don't think we exactly have time to go into that, but I'd love to talk about that at a future date.
It might be more like, did you ever see Star Trek, how the Vulcans were taught, where they each had their own personal instructor that was AI, where they just went
Yeah.
questions and answers, questions and
Right.
answers.
When is an action
Supererogatory.
when it is morally praiseworthy but not morally obligatory? Yes, that one I saw.
Yeah, that's probably where it might head if it becomes much cheaper to just get some AI. I think there's always going to be a value of having human teachers as like an emergency break for childcare reasons.
Yes.
That you always want to have a responsible adult, anyways, because computers can fail, and also computers don't have a moral compulsion to help people.
Mondays with Mike.